Well, howdy. This one should be fun. You got your Wicca on my Witchcraft. They go good together, though, sometimes. As most of you know on my channel, I've been doing this a very long time, and I've seen things come and go. And for most of my life, the dominant force in the magical world was Wicca. And Wicca was the most outspoken, uh, the most politically organized, trying to get religious rights. It is because of Wicca that we have a federally recognized version of witchcraft as a religion, and thus can get our religious rights. It is because of Wicca that our soldiers are allowed to get a pentagram on their tombstone if they die in battle. Um, Great many things have happened under Wicca, but as the time moves on, uh, forces diverge, they move farther apart, and there are many magics on the landscape making a dominant play. Um, and there are many practices that I would call witchcraft, that don't call themselves witchcraft, that are now in the forefront. And there's a lot going on out there. And, damn it. It's my phone. Um, there's a lot more out there, a lot more choices out there. Um, but when Wicca first came around, little was known about most of these practices. And a lot's been uncovered. Um, there's a lot of practices that I grew up with in witchcraft that I now know came from a different tradition. There's some stuff that came from African American traditions that I did not know at the time. Bits and pieces along the way, and I'm sure they end up with some of that too. They end up with some European things and the African strains and the African strains, and the European strains, and the Italian and the British strains. We're a melting pot here in America, and it's all got very mixed up. But now we've come to the point in history where we have a lot more data, we have a lot more tools at our fingertips, and we can trace back to the roots of each type of magic. And I like that. I've often thought that was one of the hallmarks of a witch. We don't want to know just what works. We want to know how it works, why it works, what's the beginning and end of it all. We want to follow it from its beginnings and follow it to see what it's become. God, I hate the lighting here. I am going to have to pause that. Okay, I had to change the lighting. I looked too ghost-like. It's a little better, not much. At any rate, we probably, if we follow our witchcraft proper origins back far enough, it doesn't take much scholarly wisdom at all. You can Google this shit. Probably the first publication that we have on witchcraft was from Charles Leland in 1899. And what he found in around the area of Tuscany in Italy, he found what he believed to be a pre-Christian fertility cult, in his own words, that had survived through the times of persecution intact. That later led to Margaret Murray in 1921 writing The Witch Cult in Western Europe, and furthering those ideas and finding remnants of these cults in other places around Western Europe, these fragments left behind of what we will and have called the old religion. And there's the difference right there. Wicca is a religion. That's why they have religious rights recognized federally in the United States. Witchcraft is not so much. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Witchcraft is much more malleable. So although I have been a Wiccan, I won't refer to myself as that anymore. I'm a witch because I don't subscribe to some of the Wiccan laws, and I don't always work with gods and goddesses. But it's pretty difficult to peel away European witchcraft from Wicca completely and have them both separate, partially because of the time period. All the way since the 50s when Gerald Gardner started doing his work. Um, that's where Wicca came from, the British traditions of Wicca. So we've had a very long time with that being the dominant force. However, saying that, all of Gerald Gardner's books used the word witchcraft. They said the word Wicca inside the book. And in Gerald Gardner's works, he referred to a race of people called the Wicca. He did not refer to, of all my readings of Gardner, I've never seen him refer to a religion called Wicca. And there's a lot of misinformation that comes along with it. Now, one of the problems, I guess, would be that the Gardnerians, in my experience, have been some of the most staunch traditionalists. I would call them fundamentalist witches a lot of times in their fervor. However, I have been around a long time, and I remember the story. Gerald Gardner spent a lifetime traveling the world, studying religio magic all around the world. When he was ready to retire, he settled down in the New Forest region of England. He met a coven called the New Forest Witches. That's his entrance into Wicca. Gerald Gardner could not have traveled the world studying religio magics of the world and not incorporated much of what he picked up along the way in the craft that he would come to form. Hence, from Gardnerian Wicca onward, it's an eclectic craft. We can clearly see where Gerald Gardner borrowed what he borrowed. They now have a version of Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows in print. I've read it. Interesting. However, before they put it in print, in around the year 2000, there were some malcontents that released it to the internet. And it was a different Book of Shadows. And somewhere, I hope I still have a copy of it, because I printed it up right away, knowing that it would disappear from the internet. Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows had liner notes indicating where he picked up what piece from where. He mentions Aleister Crowley many times. He's clear what he borrowed from Aleister Crowley. They actually worked together on some things. So he had no problem borrowing things to fill the gap, because we didn't have an internet back then. We didn't have access to all this information. We couldn't trace back our family trees and our roots back then. So I think what Gardner did made sense. But then there's a lot of it that makes sense. We look at the core teachings within the system. One of the big things that Gardner probably made up was the Wheel of the Year. Now, basically, all that Gardner did was he superimposed two four-spoked wheels from two different pagan cults on top of each other. The sun-worshipping pagans, like the Druids, many other cults, their prime holidays were the summer solstice, the winter solstice, spring and fall equinox, all solar holidays. And that was their, I mean, they didn't form it in a wheel, but it makes sense that it becomes a wheel later. Then there were the four major holidays, what we call the major Sabbaths, and those come from different pagan cults that honored the earth more. And so those four holidays are about earth changes, plant growth and harvest cycles, animal hunting and mating cycles, this kind of thing. And when you superimpose them on top of each other, you see clearly, and you put it in a wheel, you see clearly the sun does a thing, the earth responds with the next thing. The sun does another thing, the earth responds with the next thing. It makes sense to have put it that way. It makes sense to have put it in a wheel, because the core of all of our philosophies is going to go back to a circle. The planets are circles. The earth is a circle. Nature makes more circles than any other shape. Um, our lives, we believe in reincarnation. Our lives are seen as a circle. All of our philosophies go back to the circle, that the path of the god, the path of the goddess, circles, 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 circles. And inundated with the idea of a circle in this type of philosophy. So what Gardner did there made sense. Those holidays make sense. Those holidays weren't invented by him. He dug them up. He found, I mean, plenty of people still knew about them. They weren't that hard to dig up. These were just the old pagan holidays. But he superimposed the holidays of two different types of pagan cults upon each other, and to my knowledge, that's the first time that that had been done. But they go well together. It makes perfect sense. I can't imagine a four-spoked wheel of the year. We know, though, if you go back far enough, there were pagan cults that only recognized two halves of the year, the dark half and the light half. And then eventually there comes another spoke, and eventually there comes another spoke. This is evolution. That's how it happens. Human intervention often causes evolution. So I got no problem with Gardner at this point. However, then, we're going to take a step back to Leland, who spurred a lot of Gardner's ideas. Leland spurred Margaret Murray's ideas. Margaret Murray's ideas spurred Gardner's ideas, spurred an entire generation of witchcraft. Leland's book, Radio Gospel of the Witches, 1899, his least scholarly work, by the way. He had better books. Etruscan Roman Remains is an excellent scholarly work. Footnotes, references. Radio Gospel of the Witches basically comes about. Leland finds these witches still lurking around and practicing under the cover of night. He finds out that they have this secret book called the Gospel of Aradia that is their main book. And he, by hook or by crook, by paying off a very unscrupulous witch, gets access to fragments of those secrets. And scattered fragments they were. They barely fit into a book together. But what we can clearly see with the witches of Tuscany at that time, they believed that their main cult had existed since the 1300s in that form and had been brought into existence by the daughter of Diana, Aradia, who descended down to free the people from the persecution of the Christian church, cause an awareness, an awakening in the minds and the hearts of women, and a revolt against the Catholic Church. There are other versions of that gospel. They do not differ on that point. The only point they tend to differ on is whether Aradia was the goddess's daughter brought down here on a beam of light, or a woman who the goddess's light descended upon and then affected her and made her do the work of that goddess. Other than that, the revolt against the Catholic Church, the revival of the old religion, bringing the pagans in hiding together, that's intact in all versions of the gospel that I've seen, though there are more out there, and that has been a huge portion of my life's work is searching for these documents. But Leland had other books, like Etruscan Roman Remains, much better book. But what we can see in Radio Gospel of the Witches, lunar worship. They were primarily a lunar cult. Their works were based on the new and full moon. Primarily, the full moon was the most important thing to them because that was the time of Diana. So now we've got another set. We've got a 13-spoke wheel. Wheels upon wheels to superimpose with the two other wheels, the wheel of the sun and the wheel of the earth, and they all go well together. So the moon affects the earth, sun affects the moon, as above, so below. And there's another one. Now we're going all the way back to Hermetics, back to Hermes, basic philosophy of the craft, as above, so below. That goes all the way back to ancient Hermes. Hermes was the origins of magic, science, and medicine, all Hermes. They all come from the same place. They are brothers and sisters with each other. So that philosophy still holds to be very important, the as above, so below. Let's see, Gardner put his system together with the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, at the cardinal points on a ritual circle. Interesting idea, but not that original. We can see that in the ancient grimoires of Solomon and Agrippa. That was an ancient magic all the way back to at least Solomon and Agrippa. The 4 cardinal points were recognized, and in my research, I have found that there are countless indigenous cultures that we have come into contact with later that had not had contact with the rest of the world that fall upon this same thing, a circle on the ground marking the 4 cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. And a lot of times elemental type forces associated with those. It seems to be something born on the wind. And this is a problem I have with a lot of these people's separation anxieties between the crafts. What I have found in my research is that all around the world, similar ideas in magic have popped up. We can trace back the origins of one thing to Ireland, one thing to Africa, one thing to Italy, but then we find other people that came up with those same ideas or drastically similar ideas all over the world. And I don't think it came from Gardnerian, but the elders in my tradition used to like to say, have these lofty sayings that you had to spend the rest of your life figuring out what they meant. And one that I spent a long time trying to figure out is they had said, the craft is born on the wind and seen in the wild. And I've learned that to mean a great many things. One of the things seen in the wild is that nature moves in these patterns, symbolic patterns, shapes like circles. Nature does a whole lot of circles. Pretty rare that she does squares. They used to say that she never did squares, but there are squares in nature. It does happen. The vervain stem, for one. Born on the wind. Elementally, the wind is the east. The wind is air. Air in our philosophy is thoughts, mental capacities, the brain. It is also the air blowing around. And I have seen a great many examples on this earth that thoughts seem to float through the air. Science has just announced, just a few months ago, that the vibrations of people in our vicinity affect us. Wow, good discovery, science. Nobody ever figured that one out before. We've been talking about vibes forever. Vibration is everything on this planet. But back to the elements. So that made sense. But Gardner didn't invent that. Gardner picked that up. Again, we can see that all the way back to Solomon. We see a really cool depiction in the Secret Teachings of All Ages of a wizard calling all the elementals. Beautiful stuff. The elemental spirits, fairies, gnomes, trolls, which trolls now means a whole different thing in our language. All of these things have an elemental component to them. And way back in mystery schools before this, we also have the Watchers, the Grigori. And the Grigori are mentioned in the Bible and most of the old ancient texts. And they were the cardinal points, the cardinal stars around the planet that just happen to be in that configuration. And the Watchers, the Grigori, stood at those cardinal points around our planet, watching us for whatever reason. Let's see. Initiation. Initiation, Gardner included in his rituals, but all of the indigenous cultures, all of the pagan cultures, all over the world tended to have an initiation type rite. But what we can see with Gardner's version of initiation is he liberally borrowed what could be known of the Egyptian mysteries. The Egyptian version of initiation. Very boiled down, made much easier, but the basics, a quest to the meeting point, a symbolic death, and then a rebirth. The symbolic death and rebirth, absolutely we can find that in Egyptian mythos. We can probably find that in other cultures too, but we can definitely clearly see that was a main component of the Egyptian initiation ritual, was a symbolic death and then a rebirth. In the rebirth, you're born as a new person. Now, then there's religion. Gardner made his version religion. But he believed, or he was taught that by the New Forest witches. The New Forest witches believed themselves to be a religion. Although, back then maybe there wasn't such a division between religion and spirituality. Nowadays we can say those things and have those concepts be totally separate from each other. But so Gardner's version was a religion, and then now we have witchcraft. We have many versions of witchcraft and similar practices that are not considered a religion. Some people consider them a spirituality. They may be working more with their ancestors and other spirits than gods and goddesses, as a classical Wiccan would do. Some view it as a practice, just some stuff you do. A semblance of superstitions that make some shit happen, and we're trying to figure out why. That's some people's versions of witchcraft. But we go back to Leland's version again, 1899. The oldest things we have. It's a religion in that version. Solomon's coming off of secret Hebraic mysteries, but as such, Kabbalah, it's probably actually pre-Kabbalah, but those things become Kabbalah or associated with them. But so Solomon's work definitely had a religious component to it. He was all about secret names of God, angels, forcing demons to do his work by using secret names of God and angels. So definitely a religious component all the way back to Solomon's work. Not quite as much with Agrippa, and then there are other ancient grimoires too. But definitely was religious back then. So the core of where Gardner got his ideas was from an ancient religion. And then again, Margaret Murray follows up with the witch cult in Western Europe, and she finds evidence all over the place. People debate her scholarship, but nobody's really outdone it. Nobody's really disproven anything that she's had to say. They've just kind of argued with it. But she took that idea of a pre-Christian fertility cult still existing and hunted it further and found out more. And her book caused a revolution of spirituality and magic, and definitely led to Gardner's ideas. Then let's see, we got the ritual tools. Ritual tools, the blade, the wand, the pentacle, the cup. And look at that, there's my work phone. Okay, so the blade, wand, pentacle, and cup. Sometimes sword, staff, disc, and cup. But those go all the way back to the magician in the original tarot deck, the oldest tarot decks that we know. And that's where those ritual tools come from, but that's not their origin. Because we can see them in Solomon. Solomon has those same ritual tools, and a bunch more. Solomon did not limit himself to those tools. But those are the 4 basic tools that we see in the magician's card in the tarot. We can see those same tools represented in Solomon's work and more tools. It was a sword before it was a dagger. And in my tradition growing up, and they definitely took a religious leaning towards that. Their telling of it was that during the times of persecution, if you were in possession of a sword but did not carry the office of a sword, i.e. military or law enforcement, that could get you killed. that meant you were probably a witch, a wizard, a sorcerer. They're the only ones having swords that aren't, fighters. Um, so that was a problem. The staff was probably the original tool, and what they said there too is that the staff was too readily recognizable, so they basically made a smaller version of the sword and a smaller version of the staff. Becomes your wand and your blade. But there are still tarot decks that do wands. Some do staves. They mix it up. But those those tools we can find all the way back there, and the pentacle. So there too, Gardner includes the pentagram, the five-pointed star, each point representing an element, and the top point representing spirit. He puts it top point up because in the philosophy of Wicca that he was creating, it represented, it was the right-hand path. It represented spirit over the flesh. The inverted pentagram with the point pointing down represented the left-hand path, flesh over the spirit. And those people always seemed to exist side by side. They didn't necessarily consider themselves a religion like Gardner did, and they were not so nice. But there again, find the pentagram with Solomon. Probably the origins of the pentagram as we know it, because the pentagram is depicted inverted in the Hebraic Tree of Life. Solomon also probably, as far as I could figure, he originated the hexagram before it became the Star of David. Or was he David's son? I always forget that part. But Solomon's the first place that we see those used as occult religious symbols: the pentagram, five-pointed star, and the hexagram, the six-pointed star. And the elemental depiction of the points, not sure that's exactly that clear in Solomon's work, but he had angels associated with the points in some of his works, and the angels had an elemental component to them. Also, the archangels were set at the cardinal points, so they had an elemental component to them as well. But really, where we see that, the pentagram as we use it now was borrowed from ceremonial magic. Ceremonial magic having its roots in the ancient grimoires of the old magicians, like Solomon and Agrippa, Abramelin, these kind of people. So that's the pentagram. So all of these practices I have no problem with. I tend to use most of that. I'm not always working with gods. I'm not always working with goddesses, but I've spent so much time become a priest of several of them. I can't just leave them. Sorry about that. I got a text message. So I can't just leave them. Ritual tools. I have more ritual tools than the standard, but I've used those most of my life. I ultimately think that eventually you want to get to the point where you don't need the ritual tools, but you do that through the ritual tools. You use the ritual tools first, and you eventually get to the point where you can do it without the ritual tools. When I am around my ritual tools, I'll probably use them anyways, but I can do it without those tools. I prefer to do it with those tools because, like I always say, I could probably screw a screw into a piece of wood with my fingers, but it would be easier and more accurate to do it with a screwdriver. It would be easier and more accurate. It would work better doing it with a tool. That's why we invented tools with our hands, to make the work of our hands easier to do. I sometimes am religious with it. I sometimes am spiritual with it. I sometimes am working with things that aren't exactly called gods. But the people of those cultures viewed them very similar to gods. They just didn't use that terminology. I find myself working with working outside my gene pool often, but gotta say, I'm working with magics from all over the world, and I I did get a DNA test, but it wasn't the one that broke down my DNA and gave me an exact picture of how much percentage of where. I basically got, you're this much European and you're this much that. So I did find out I am 7% African American. So I have, and that's new to me. Never knew that one. So that was one of the cultures in my DNA that I had not explored. I find myself exploring that these days. But Irish, Italian, Danish, Norwegian, German, French, Scottish, a lot of Scottish, Italian. I think of everything but Hispanic. Oh, Asian. I'm not Asian. I don't think I have any Asian in my chart. But I never really had a leaning towards that. Though I recognize that Gardner borrowed a lot from them too. The meditation techniques used in early Wicca, the majority of them come from the Eastern philosophies. And even the idea of meditation is an Eastern idea. So Gardner did borrow from all these cultures, but I think he did those philosophies honor. He wasn't a dick about it. I don't know if that could be called cultural appropriation or just finding the pieces that are scattered all over the world to make a whole component. I think that there is some universal truth, there is some universal magics, and the gods, the spirits, our ancestors, whoever you will, scattered those components upon the wind, maybe to bring us together. So far it hasn't really brought us together. It tends to bring us apart. It tends to be a way for people to sow division, say, oh, you're not really true because you're not pure Viking blood, or you can't practice an African religion because you have light skin, stuff like that. I don't think, I think one of the problems, gods, goddesses, spirits, they give a fuck what color you are. They don't give a fuck because they are not a color. So I may butt some heads with some people on that idea. I understand everybody's got their cultural isms, their cultural belief systems. I don't think that the gods or the spirits give a fuck. I don't think they have gender, and I don't think they have race. And what they sure in the hell don't have is bigotry and prejudice. I do not agree with the way some people do cultural appropriation. They find something from somebody else's culture and take it from them. Now me, I could do that to everything except Asian and Hispanic, and that's one of my cultures. I'm a mutt. Sorry. It's going to be really hard to put that label on me, but for other people, there's some people that just take a thing with no respect, do it no honor. I think when you enter into an existing system, you should follow that path. If you follow that path, there may be other paths to go on, and you may take some tricks that you picked up along the way, and you may add those to your bag of tricks. You did that with respect, with honor to those deities, those spirits, those ancestors. Don't have a problem with that. Gods are going to touch you. Spirits, in some people's traditions, they don't believe that the gods touch them at all, but some people get knocked on the head. I guess, I don't believe I have any Hispanic blood. Italian's Latin, but not quite the same. But I did one time have Santa Muerte burst into my shop and demand a space be set up for her. And I didn't even know who she was. I thought, whoa, that's cool, Grim Reaper looking god. Who the hell is that? And I looked at it for a while and I found out, wow, wait a minute. So this goddess covers protection, attack, love, money, and wealth. I think 5 things just there. And she covers more than that. But I never had run across a whole lot of deities or saints that covered that many things, that you could call on for that many things. So I was fascinated by her, and I learned. So first, she burst into my shop, demanded a space. I've told this story in another video, so I'm not going to go on. I set up an entire shrine that took up the majority of my bookshelf in my shop. And these are large bookshelves, by the way, and I needed a lot of bookshelves because I sold a lot of books. She demanded her own shrine be there. And as soon as I did that, her devotees started showing up and leaving her offerings and praying over in the little corner of my store. And I just went, oh, all right. Well, so now there's one. There's a Hispanic deity who is also a folk saint that did call on me. She did demand that I recognize her. That kind of shit can't happen. But I followed up on it by learning about her, by learning her likes, her dislikes, and doing her honor. Doing her honor and doing an honorable practice with Santa Muerte. And I have no problem with that ever. But the big world, a lot of the same ideas that come up. Here in America, a lot of those ideas just blend together. I don't think it's a bad thing. But I mentioned Leland's Etruscan Roman remains. A thing I always remember from Etruscan Roman remains is a little folk magic that Leland had found along the way. And I think it was Italian. It was basically a wheat braid hung in front of the house at the doorstep. The same magic I've seen in Ireland, seen in Britain, many other places. Braided piece of wheat hanging across the doorway. Why? To protect you from witches. The follow-up on that is that witches are of the nature that when coming across a complex pattern in nature, they must follow it. They must follow it to its end and back to its beginning. If they find something woven, they must unweave it, find out how it was woven, and then weave it back together. The belief, silly folk belief that it was, but it did tell us something about the nature of the race of witches. Witches could perhaps be called the original OCDs, because the belief was that the witch would have to stop on your doorstep, unweave this thing all the way, and then weave it back together while you ran out the back door to get away from them. I have seen this elsewhere. There's even a movie, a terrible horror movie, but they did a little bit of research. They came up on some interesting things. A movie called Warlock. And there's, in Warlock we see foot track magic. Foot track magic from a European source. European foot track magic, which we see here in America in Hoodoo and other of the ATRs. Foot track magic. That was something that they already had over there in Europe too. And I don't think that they came and exchanged the ideas. I think people just came up with similar ideas because it's born on the wind. But in this movie, this guy's running from the warlock, and he takes a bunch of pebbles and throws them down again on a doorstep, and the warlock he stops. And he has to count them all. He cannot enter until he's counted all the pebbles. So I think they were trying to say that the original race of witches was where OCD came from. But whenever I come across a philosophy in the craft, I always try and weave more out of the philosophy. Find out what more does that mean? And that's what it's come to mean, that idea has come to mean to me. The nature of the witch, we need to follow the pattern all the way. And now that we have the technology at our hands and the data, the ability to access the data, I want to know where every one of my magics came from, and I want to know how they got to me. I want to know what ideas were exchanged along the way with other cultures that blended into that idea. Whatever manifested in the forming of that magic, I want to know it. It's my job to know it, and that's why I always say that. A witch doesn't need to know just what works. They need to know how and why it works. This is a science. And I've diverged onto a whole other point, but I'm trying to get your Wicca out of my witchcraft. It's tough.